Hello, welcome to Scrum tutorial from Launchpad. Here's the list of topics that we are going to cover in this tutorial. We'll go over the background and definition of Scrum, go over some of its advantages and features, principles, values, and theory of Scrum. What are the roles of different Scrum team members, their responsibilities, the events that typically take place during and after a Scrum sprint, artifacts that are part of Scrum, user story, rules of Scrum, and then we are going to sum it up with the conclusion and next steps. Now, before we jump into details of Scrum, let's spend some time going over the background in terms of what different development methodologies are. As some of you may be aware, that a lot of the companies up until a decade or two back used a methodology called waterfall. Now, this is a rigid methodology in the terms that it's non-iterative, non-adaptive. It has a long release cycle. So typically you would have 4 to 5 phases where you would have spent a couple of months doing discovery and definition of the product. So writing down requirements. And then you will get into technical designs and architecture details. Then you would get into a phase where you're doing the software development. You will go into internal testing phase, and finally, as applicable, a user acceptance testing stage, and then the product would be released. And this would take anywhere between 6 months to a year. And if you come up with new requirements, that's generally considered a scope creep, and it's difficult to handle within waterfall methodology. But agile methodology is another form of development that has come into prominence over sort of last decade or two. And Scrum is one of the more popular examples of agile methodology. There are some other ones like Kanban and extreme programming, which we are not going to cover in detail in this tutorial. One of the reasons why agile has been used so well over last decade or so is because it suits well to SaaS software development. Now, keep in mind that every time you deploy software to your end users or clients or customers, there's an overhead. And for enterprise software, if the application is deployed on premise behind the firewall, it becomes really difficult to go ahead with application releases every 2 weeks, 3 weeks, something that you would associate with Scrum. So I think it fits in really well with the SaaS development model. There's another development model that organizations can use. It's hybrid. It's a mix of waterfall and agile. So think of it as a scenario where you could do your sort of short-term fixes. You can release them every couple of weeks, and these would not just be bug fixes. There could be feature improvements as well. And then you could do your big ticket items and you can release them, every 3 months, 6 months, a year or so. How can you incorporate hybrid methodology? Here are some examples to do that. You could have something like feature toggles as an example. So you could keep building the code for those big ticket items, but keep some sort of environment level locks that do not that keep those features hidden from the end user. And while that code could be in production, user would never be aware of that. Another example could be you spin out separate environments to do those big ticket item developments. Obviously, with either of those approaches, there is some overhead in terms of maintaining those environments or making sure that half-baked code does not break anything in production. As mentioned earlier, Scrum is a form of agile development methodology. It's an adaptive and iterative framework that allows you to creatively solve complex problems in an efficient manner. Here are some reasons why Agile and specifically Scrum are so great. Uh, it's a generic methodology. So while Scrum has mainly been used for software development, you could pretty much use it for anything, for solving any complex projects. The process in itself is adaptive and iterative. So you don't need to build the entire solution in one go. You can break down the solution and requirements into chunks, often known as user stories. You can work on them, you can release, you can get feedback from end users, and then you're able to improvise based on the feedback. There are obviously faster release times. As we discussed earlier with Waterfall, the end-to-end release cycle could take as long as a year, which is not the case for Scrum. You could have sprint cycles varying anywhere between a week to somewhere around 3 to 4 weeks. It is lightweight, so there aren't a whole lot of processes that different team members need to work with. It does not have a whole lot of rules that you need to work under. The process in itself is easy to learn, as you will find out in this tutorial. Having said that, it is a lifelong journey to master Scrum. Now let's take a look at Scrum Principles, which is essentially captured by theory and values. There are three components to Scrum theory: transparency, inspection, and adaptation. Transparency, in a nutshell, means that everyone has a common understanding, has a common language in terms of the processes, in terms of what's been agreed upon. So there are no disagreements. An example of that would be what does it mean to mark a ticket as complete? So everyone should be working with the same set of acceptance criteria and should not be working with different set of rules. Inspection, it simply means that everyone should have complete visibility and the ability to inspect all the artifacts and be able to monitor or then inspect any deviations from what has been agreed upon. Adaptation, as discussed earlier, through various Scrum events, you should be able to adapt in case you're building something that was not agreed upon in terms of requirements, or you are deviating away from the Scrum process as a whole. Let's go over the values. It takes commitment from each of the team members in terms of what they are supposed to do, what their roles and responsibilities are to be able to deliver results in a sprint cycle. It takes courage to work on complex and challenging problems. It requires focus to make sure that at any given moment, the team members are focusing on what's part of a certain sprint, and you don't move outside that. Openness. Everyone should be able to challenge and question in case they notice a deviation or something is not going according to plan. All the team members should have a mutual respect for other team members as well as their capabilities. Now let's go over the Scrum team roles. There are essentially three key team members when it comes to running a Scrum sprint. First one is the product owner, and we are going to cover that in detail in one of the other tutorials. But the job of the product owner is essentially to move everything to the sprint. And what that means is writing up and moving items to the product backlog, creating user stories, prioritizing stuff in product backlog, which is referred to as backlog grooming, and then doing sprint planning with the development team members, which essentially means taking up a set of items from the backlog and then coming to a mutual agreement in terms of what can be agreed upon during a certain sprint. At the same time, before the sprint as well as during the sprint, it's the job of the product owner to provide any clarifications to any queries that development team members may have. In addition to that, it's the job of product owner to communicate to all stakeholders in terms of what's happening with the sprint, essentially create visibility around everything. Then we have software development team. This team is supposed to be self-sustaining and organizing. The team should understand what Scrum means, what its rules and principles are, and on a day-to-day basis, they should not need external help to ingrain Scrum methodology into them. Then sort of not really outside the Scrum team, but we have another role called Scrum Master. Scrum Master generally works at an organizational level, and his or her job is to make sure that all the Scrum teams are following the Scrum guidelines. And then during key events, during the sprint or after the sprint, Scrum Master would get involved to provide oversight. Now let's spend some time going over Scrum artifacts. We essentially have three artifacts as defined by Scrum: product backlog, sprint backlog, and increment. Product backlog is essentially a list of everything. So all the feature improvements, all the requests from all the stakeholders that you need to add to the product features that go into the backlog. And generally, as part of the backlog grooming, it is the job of the product owner to make sure that everything is prioritized so things can be picked from the top of the backlog and be moved to the sprint. And the product owner also needs to make sure that nothing is missing from the backlog. So all the key requirements are documented as user stories generally in the backlog. Then the second artifact is sprint backlog. Sprint backlog is essentially what product owner and development team agree to in terms of what are those tickets from the product backlog that would be moved to a certain sprint. And the goal is to finish all the tickets in the sprint backlog. Finally, we have increment. Think of increment as something that adds value to the users. So it is a set of tickets or user stories that are done during a sprint, often defined as the sprint goal. And once those things are released as a single increment, they can be released to the end users. And increment in true sense is incremental. So with every sprint, once you release an increment, which is a set of user stories, that gets added to the previous increment from the product backlog. As an example, something you did in the previous sprint. Now let's go over sprint events and who attends these events. Sprint overall is a time box process. So essentially it can be no longer than a month. You can have sprint cycles which could be a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, leading up to 4 weeks. But that time is generally agreed upon and cannot be changed during the course of a sprint. The first stage is sprint planning. And as discussed earlier, that's essentially a process where team members such as the product owner and the developer and even the Scrum Master could be part of that meeting, and they can discuss which items from the product backlog would be part of the sprint increment and would be moved to a sprint. Then you have daily scrums. Essentially, you could have somewhere between 50 to 30-minute meetings where you could discuss any challenges that the developers or the team members are facing while executing a sprint. If there are any clarifications required, product owner could be part of the scrum and they could answer developers' queries. Then there is a sprint review. At the end of every sprint, team members can reflect upon whether the goal of the sprint was achieved or not, what was not accomplished, and then whatever was delivered, it could be demoed or displayed to the relevant stakeholders. Sprint retrospective. While sprint review is specific to a sprint, retrospective is more about the overall process. So once in a while, all the team members, the development team members, owners, and the Scrum Master could sit down and they could try to visualize what's not working within the process as a whole, or if during the process they were under certain deviations against what was agreed upon, so the overall process can be improved. Now let's spend some time going over the definition of user story. Generally speaking, user story is not a part of Scrum framework and processes. However, with most development companies, user story is an integral part of what Scrum teams work on. So, what is a user story? A user story is essentially who, what, and why. It's a concise description of who the user is, what do they want to do, and why they want to do it. So, I'll give you an example. As a CFO of a company, so that's who, I would like to run financial reports, that is what, so that I can make better decisions for my company, and that is why. A user story does not focus on how to make something happen. User story within a development ticket is generally supplemented with UI assets that could be wireframes or high fidelity mockups, whatever the development team is comfortable with. Uh, and then acceptance criteria, which is essentially a one-stop list where you can put all the rules, all the ways in which different clicks are supposed to behave when someone interacts with the application. All the logic, pretty much everything goes into the acceptance criteria, and that's kind of important because going back to our definition of how do you mark a user story complete or done, acceptance criteria plays a major role in that. A collection of user stories could be defined in two ways. One is epic, second is theme. These are all kind of bigger projects within Scrum framework. Epic is a collection of user stories where you cannot release all the user stories sort of one by one or in subsets. They are connected to one another and they are not independent. So I'll give you an example. A user wants to set up his credit card account. So for user to be able to do that, there's a user story where they have to enter their email and password. There could be a user story around putting their credit card info. There could be user story around, putting their shipping address and billing address, that kind of stuff. And unless you do all those things together, you cannot release that to the end user. It won't add any value. On the other hand, theme is a set of user stories that could be released independently. For example, we want to build a set of reports for our procurement department. Now there could be 5 different kind of reports. A report that's around operations, a report that's around productivity, a report that's around financials. And you could release them independently, and that would still add value to the business user. So at the end of the sprint, what happens to unfinished tickets? That's kind of a tricky one. Uh, Generally followed processes across organizations is that if the certain tickets are not done, you put the status in terms of what was accomplished, why something was not accomplished. So it can be looked at during the sprint review. And then those tickets are moved back to the backlog. So from the product backlog, they could be added back to the next sprint. Finally, let's go over some of the key rules of Scrum process. Sprint length, as discussed earlier, it could be a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, but no longer than 4 weeks. I think that's kind of the upper limit. Time spent in sprint planning. We discussed what sprint planning means earlier on in this tutorial, but a general rule of thumb is that you would spend somewhere around sort of a day, that would be 8 hours for a sprint that is around sort of 3 to 4 weeks long. Scope of the sprint. Once the sprint has started, you cannot add new stuff to the sprint. However, there could always be queries from the development team that product owner answers. And if part of that, as part of those clarifications, if there are slight changes to the ticket, that's okay as long as the broader functionality is still the same and the quality of development and the quality of product has not suffered. Sprint cancellation. This generally does not happen One scenario could be that everything that you are building no longer applies. It's no longer a market requirement, and you could simply cancel the sprint and throw everything out, not just of the sprint backlog, but then product backlog as well. Who can cancel a sprint? It's the product owner. What's an appropriate size for the user story, especially from the development perspective? This is again kind of the outside of the Scrum framework, but generally, a user story should be as simple as it can be. So, as an example, if you have a screen which has 4 subsections, each of those should have their own user story, and potentially each of the fields could have their own user story. A broad rule of thumb is that if it's taking developer more than 1 day to finish a user story, that user story can be broken down into sort of further into mini user stories or their own user stories. What's the definition of done? As discussed earlier, there should be well-detailed acceptance criteria and other rules around how a ticket is marked as completed. So at the end of the process, developers and other team members like owners or stakeholders should not have different understanding, in the sense that developers could say something is done while owners or stakeholders might not agree. So clear definition at the start of the process should always be there. To conclude this tutorial, if you are interested in getting trained or certified, be it for a Scrum product owner role or being a Scrum master, or if you want to educate yourself, there are lots of reading materials and training resources that you will find on the first 2 links of the screen. And if you have any questions for us, you can add a comment to this video, or alternatively submit feedback on launchpad.com. Thank you for attending this tutorial.